Hi, Nancy. Mary here. I made it.
Oh, hi. Thank you. I hope the meeting was okay. Well,
Yep, it
yeah.
worked well. Yeah.
You need to show me.
I love all the friends.
See, I'm Ann Johnson's mother. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for being here. Hi, everybody. Just letting some folks in from the waiting room. We'll get started in a couple, but it's great to folks who know Nancy or maybe folks who don't know anybody. It's awesome to hear from you and say hi. We're so glad you can be here with us.
The light is certainly changing here. As it starts to get grayer, you know, it's like, oh.
Thanks, Alba. Yes, we were all speculating about the northeast storm that's about to come, but we'll see. So nice. Hi from the Hudson River Valley or Hudson River Museum.
Oh, wow.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Glad you're home, hunkering down. It's a good day to be working from home. I will say that.
Thank you.
And another person from California. Hi.
Thank you for spending your morning with us if you're calling in from.
Really? Talk about sacrifice. Sheesh.
You're worth it, Nancy.
Yeah, well. It's art, you know, it's not me.
I know, I'm sorry if my goal is to make you blush on the call. That's not.
Hi, Abby.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see who that's coming from.
I know it's hard to, yeah.
Coming from Kathy.
Hello. Thanks for being here.
We're Californians, yay.
Yes. Frank.
Oh, hi.
Frank.
A very distinguished dance historian there, and dancer, and choreographer, and author. That's one person.
Very nice. Who is that on the call, Nancy?
I'm sorry?
Oh, I said, who are you? Lots of friends and friendly faces.
Exactly.
Well, thank you all for being here. We're going to give folks another minute and then we'll get started. I know we have quite a few people registered today. I'm expecting we already have a great crowd, 40 people here, but just note, you are in the right place for Art at Noon. It's been so nice for the folks who are here early to say hi. It's one of my favorite parts, that at the end when we all sign off and unmute ourselves. It's great to kind of get a sense, even though I know we're all across the country. We've got lots of people from California, Louisiana, and then of course we're hosting this out of Philadelphia.
I would like to say hi. Hi, Nancy.
I mean, you know, coming in quotation marks. These days.
Hi, Nancy.
From Chicky.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Should I tell everyone how we know one another?
Why not? They're vamping.
Nancy was my little sister at Middlebury College, and we met up again a number of years later. We had seen one another, then lost touch, and then met up again. So it's wonderful.
This is cool.
I love it. So many nice people here from far and wide. It's great to know, Charlotte. If you've known Nancy, you don't have to tell us any dirt on the call, but maybe afterwards you can share some stories.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Randy. I appreciate that.
Yeah, right. Only good ones.
Oh, of course.
That. So I expect we're going to have some more folks joining us, but I want to get started because I know Nancy has a lot of amazing scholarship to share with all of us. So I just wanted to do a quick welcome and thank you all so much for being here with us. If this is anybody's first program hosted by PAFA, I'm Abby King, the Assistant Director of Adult Programs. So if you come to things, I'm sure you've seen my face on Zoom quite a bit, and we're so lucky to have you here with us. We're streaming out of Philadelphia today. And I wanted to start today with a big thank you from the folks I've seen quite a few of, our members. Thank you for coming out and supporting us today and every day. You've really made this year on our last program of 2020, our last live program, a really memorable one. So thank you for being here with us through the journey that is 2020. I also want to thank the folks that helped make this program happen. This is our last fall art at lunch, and this lecture series is supported by the Barron family in memory of Rose Susan Hirshhorn Barron, a former docent at the Academy and a great supporter of its education programs. So thank you, of course, for the ongoing support from the Barrons. I did want to mention just some quick Zoom thoughts and scheduling before we get started in case anybody's new. I'm going to first start by asking everybody to mute themselves. So I'm going to do that now. Nancy, please unmute yourself. I'm just going to do that. I will mention, so this is a live program. We do want to hear from you, but at the Q&A and in our chat. So I'm going to ask you to stay muted for the duration of the program, except at the end, we will have time for questions. So feel free to drop things in the chat as we go, but no, we'll address them at the end. Or if you have questions, you can direct chat me. I'm happy to help with anything you need. And then no, at the end, we love if you want to ask a question verbally, I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand. So the way you do that is by clicking the participant button, and then there's a raise hand function. But I'll go over that at the end, so you don't have to worry about it for the next 45 minutes. I did want to mention that today's program is inspired by the exhibition Taking Space, Contemporary Women Artists and the Politics of Scale, which will be opening next year. And like I said, our wonderful scholar, Nancy Heller, who I'm going to introduce in just a second, is going to be showing some images along the way, inspired in part by one of the pieces in that show, Audrey Flack's Vanitas. The only other thing I'd love to mention is we are recording today's program. So just to mention, this will be going on our PAFA's YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat, because if you miss us during the short break we're taking for the holiday season, note that we have a wonderful library that we've been accumulating since February. We have about 65 programs now. So if you miss us the next couple of weeks, you want to hear some art history lectures, know that you can always go on our YouTube channel and check out maybe some things that you've missed. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. This is such a nice one to end the season on, because Nancy, I think, was one of the first lectures I helped organize. I know you predated me at PAFA, but you're always so wonderful to work with, and I love your lectures. So it's really a pleasure to be the one today introducing you. Nancy G. Heller is the professor of art history at the University of Arts. She's taught at several other colleges, including the University of Maryland, Texas A&M, which I think we have some folks from Texas on the call. It's really cool. And Georgetown University. Her most recent books are the 4th revised and expanded edition of Women Artists, An Illustrated History, and Why a Painting is Like a Pizza, a guide to understanding and enjoying modern art. She also co-wrote and co-edited Imagining Dance, Visual Representations of Dancers and Dancing, and contributed a chapter to Flamenco on the Global Stage, Historical, Critical, and Theoretical Perspectives. In addition to giving lectures for numerous museums, clubs, universities, and other venues, Heller has presented scholarly papers at art and dance history conferences across the US and in Lisbon, London, Seville, Rome, and in Romania. Dr. Heller has received awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian Institution, the American Association of University Women, the Richard C. von Hess Foundation, and the government of Spain. And since 1984, she's been a student, teacher, and performer of Spanish dance, and a writer and lecturer on related subjects. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed scholar today, Nancy Heller.
Okay, let's see if I can do this right. So far, so good. Ta-da! Okay, we did it. Well, thank you very much, Abby, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. As you already heard, but let me just say it again. What we're going to be looking at, is, she says, well, it's for some reason not, I knew something had to happen. It doesn't want to advance. Why not?
Oh, you have to click on the arrows at the bottom of the screen there. So we see. There we go.
It'll go. Now it just needed to be. We needed to prime the pump. Sorry. Anyway, hi again. So this is the painting that I'll be talking about with you in more detail later by Audrey Flack, World War II Vanitas. It was recently acquired by the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, or PAFA. And as Abby just said, it's one of the pieces featured in the exhibition that certainly I'm really looking forward to seeing next year. Meanwhile, my goal here, which I guess is sort of obvious, is to try to put that painting into sort of a broader context in various ways. So some things about the artist, first of all. So Audrey Flack, as my late mother would say, she's one tough Jewish broad from New York City. Now 89 years old, Flack is reportedly just as energetic, just as productive, just as multi-talented, just as innovative, and certainly just as courageous as she has been for the past half century since she first became famous as a photorealist painter in the early 1970s. And having said photorealist, before I go any further, I think it might help to make sure we all know what we're talking about. Yeah, it doesn't want to do that. Okay, we'll do it that way. Photorealism, yay. As you can see, it's also spelled as one word or with two words without that lovely little hyphen. And occasionally you'll see it referred to as hyperrealism, superrealism, and who knows, probably dog food. Myself personally, I prefer the first version, but however you write it, photorealism refers to paintings based on photographs and intended to look as much as possible like photographs, especially works produced by a number of American artists, mostly based in New York, beginning in the 1970s. And there are several variations, as I'm sure a lot of you know, among the photorealists in terms of how they use photographs. They also tend to specialize in different types of subject matter, just to mention two examples. Chuck Close, you probably know, is famous for close-ups of people's faces, whereas Richard Estes tends to be better known for works like this, New York City street scenes, but without any people in them. Now, Flack has also painted both portraits and architecture, but she's probably most celebrated and she's definitely most often criticized for her still lifes. And a good example of one of those is this, Spaced Out Apple from 1974. It's a little bit cropped here, I should say, but if you look at it without the words, now it's called Spaced Out Apple, but you can see there are apples, but also oranges and a pear and two pieces of cut fruit, all of them seeming to float in this kind of clearly impossible sort of a space. But check out, for example, the juiciness of that orange slice and even that extraneous little bit of pulp and the brown areas. If you look, can you see this when I do this? Let's see, yeah, down there at the apple where it's starting to get a little, you know, a little icky. Or for that matter, the sort of lumpy texture of that orange rind and the light reflecting off the apple skin. I mean, it is so detailed. I hope it is on however you're seeing it. It's so detailed and so realistic. Really, it's impossible to believe that this is a painting and not a photograph. And let me just tell you, it's equally difficult to believe that when you see it in person. Now, just to sort of do another little sidebar here, the irony is that, of course, right now, we're all looking on a variety of electronic devices at digital images taken from reproductions of paintings meant to look like photographs. I mean, it's really kind of strange. So we just do the best we can, yes? Another food-based still life by Flack, which maybe is not fair to show at what on the East Coast anyway is lunchtime, is that. I think I gained weight just looking at it. It's called Strawberry Tart, and it's also from 1974. Now, check out that luscious sort of oozing glaze there. And I hope you can also see that it's, well, it's just sort of remarkable, but can you also see around the edges that some of the areas are deliberately painted to look blurry? Because remember, with a photorealist work, the canvas is not supposed to look like a strawberry tart. It's supposed to look like a photograph of a strawberry tart, which may seem strange, but that is kind of the point here. And I should also mention before I get too carried away, this guy, Louis K. Meisel, who's kind of the godfather of photorealism in a way. Meisel is credited with coining that term in 1969. More importantly, his self-named New York City gallery was and still is really the principal gallery to promote photorealism right from its beginning. And Meisel has represented Flack since 1972. He also gave her her first solo exhibition 2 years later. So he's really had, an enormous positive effect on Flack's career and on that of many other photorealists. But in fairness, I should also point out that of the 38 photorealist painters, handled by the Meisel Gallery, according to its website, 36 of the 38 are men. And during the heyday of photorealism, Flack was the only woman in that group. Just to show you this, because it's kind of an interesting photograph. There we go. So I couldn't find out who everybody is here. And I don't know who that woman in the foreground is. But you'll notice the only other woman is Audrey Flack, very blonde there, sitting down. And she's seated there from our point of view between Richard Estes on the left and Charles Bell. Now talk about a men's club. And of course, it's hardly surprising that all of these artists are white. Also, I just wanted to mention this again is Flack, again, looking very pleased, as though she just swallowed a couple of canaries there. As one of the very few women to become a successful painter of any background, working in any style during the decade of the 70s, Flack, as you might imagine, had to overcome a great many challenges. And fortunately, she was well equipped to do this. Audrey Flack was born May 30th, 1931, to Jeanette and Morris Flack in a mainly Jewish part of Washington Heights, the northernmost section of Manhattan in New York. Here's the young family, including Flack's brother Milton, who was 6 years older. Flack's parents were part of a wave of Jews who emigrated to the US from Eastern Europe to escape growing anti-Semitism. Washington Heights was already home to a large number of Irish immigrants who'd settled there in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And the area didn't become a mainly Spanish-speaking neighborhood with residents mainly from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, as celebrated, I had to get this in there, as celebrated by Lin-Manuel Miranda in his Tony Award-winning Broadway musical, In the Heights. That didn't happen until about the 1980s. Back to Audrey Flack, though. As is clear, I think, from that rather mischievous expression on her face, Flack was a bright, rebellious, hyperactive child. In elementary school, she was forever being sent out of the classroom to sit by herself in the hallway. This was meant, obviously, as a punishment, but Flack says she loved it. She loved spending time alone because she could draw. She drew all the time, and she quickly became known as the class artist, so she was asked to provide, illustrations and decorations for all sorts of occasions. Even then, Flack says she understood that art was, quote, her way to deal with the world, end quote. And her childhood world wasn't always easy to deal with. Hers was a family of middle-class, observant but not Orthodox Jews, and Flack grew up well aware of the tensions and sometimes the violence that existed between the nearby Irish gang members and her own community. Flack was 10 when the US entered World War II, old enough to understand something anyway about what was happening to European Jews, especially once her brother Milton was drafted into the military 3 years later. Meanwhile, Flack's mother, who you see here, reportedly loved to play cards, not just, socially with friends, but seriously and badly enough, unfortunately, that as Flack put it, quote, she used to lose the grocery money, unquote. Flack also recalls being left alone a lot as a child and feeling jealous of the other kids whose mothers, she said, picked them up from school, whereas her mother often arrived late or not at all. Early on, Flack was determined to become an artist, though, so she spent as much time as she could visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She also set her sights on attending New York's prestigious High School of Music and Art, whose distinguished alumni include everybody from Diane Carroll to Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul and Mary, the designer Milton Glaser, and NPR's beloved Susan Stamberg. Encouraged by her father, with whom she was really pretty close, and buoyed by some innate sense of self-confidence, I guess, Flack ignored the embarrassment she felt at bringing her dime store purchased plastic portfolio to the high school's admissions session, where she said the other kids all seemed to have expensive leather portfolios. And she kept her cool when she was asked to create a drawing on the spot using charcoal, even though she'd never used charcoal before. She got in. And more than that, Flack says, when she compared her work to everyone else's, she said she knew that she was good and that she could succeed as an artist. As somebody who had always preferred wearing jeans to bouffant skirts, Flack was keenly aware of being different from the other little girls in her neighborhood, especially in 1930s, 40s New York. But at music and art, she says, she finally felt like she fit in, and she loved being around all the, quote, leftist teachers and talented kids, end quote. Still in high school, Flack struggled, though, to make the kind of art that she really wanted. She wanted to make realistic art. And in late 1940s New York, well, it had really become the center of the avant-garde Western universe as far as visual art was concerned, with the development of abstract expressionism, which of course is not realistic at all. So the only acceptable kind of art, as far as Flack's high school teachers were concerned, was abstraction. Ever the rebel, and this is very peculiar, Flack spent hours copying European old master art in secret to avoid being labeled hopelessly old-fashioned. She said she knew there were important lessons she could only learn from traditional paintings, and throughout her life, Flack juggled seemingly opposite goals in both her art and her personal life. Flack's next educational experience was at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, otherwise known as Cooper Union, a famously progressive institution that had admitted students of all races, including women, from its founding in 1859. Flack says, quote, Cooper Union was the greatest art school in the world at that time, and it opened a whole new world for me, end quote. During her years there, and we're talking 1948 to 51, Flack was a radical abstract painter most of the time. Her school was located in Greenwich Village, close to the major abstract expressionist artist studios, and also to the very famous Cedar Tavern there on your left, the bar where all the abstract expressionists seemed to hang out. Flack went there too. Through a teacher at Cooper Union, she met Jackson Pollock on your right, and Willem de Kooning and Franz Klein, and all the other biggies. Flack says, quote, it was thrilling. I was dating those guys, end quote. And like them, she was an abstract expressionist. She says, quote, I was throwing paint at the canvas from 30 feet away, end quote, which obviously is as different as it could possibly be from Flack's mature photorealist style. On the recommendation of a Cooper Union teacher, Flack won a scholarship to attend Yale University, then as now famous for its very strong painting program. Needless to say, her parents were over the moon, although Flack's mother did worry, quote, that too much education would ruin Flack's chances for marriage, end quote. You know how mothers are. The head of Yale's art department then was Joseph Albers, a German emigre painter who was also one of the most influential art teachers of the 20th century, first at the Bauhaus in Germany, then at Black Mountain College in North Carolina, and finally at Yale. Albers is probably best known today for works like that one on your right, his series of paintings, Homage to the Square, which he began in 1950. And again, those are totally unlike the brushy, visceral, emotion-filled style of abstract expressionism. And of course, they're abstract, so they're nothing like photorealism either. Albers' goal, he said, was essentially to sensitize students to the subtle interrelationships among various colors and to work on the illusion that some of those colored planes were actually moving forward while others were receding into space. Very sadly, it turns out that Albers molested some of his female students, including Flack. Her response, she says, was to stop taking his classes and to focus on the positive aspects of her time at Yale, especially a course on the iconography, meaning symbolism, of the Bible. Quote, it changed my life, she said, and the opportunity to continue filling sketchbooks with more secretly copied images from European Old Master artworks. In 1953, 22-year-old Flack was back in New York. Very sadly, her father died shortly after her return. Meanwhile, she was still juggling two contradictory impulses to be an abstract expressionist painter while continuing to learn more about realism. To do the latter, Flack studied human anatomy at the famous, on your left, the Art Students League in New York, and she studied art history at NYU's equally prominent Institute of Fine Arts. So just think about that. At this early point in her adult life, Flack had already studied at virtually all the most important art institutions in the Northeastern US, Music and Art High School, Cooper Union, Yale, Art Students League, and the Institute of Fine Arts. Obviously very interested in being trained properly. Meanwhile, Flack was kind of living the dream, as she describes it, of the romantically, the starving New York artist, renting a loft space with huge holes in the floor in a condemned building on 8th Street. She was back with the Cedar Tavern crowd, and she demonstrated her commitment to abstract expressionism by creating powerful paintings like this on your left, Abstract Force, Homage to Franz Klein, and that is a Franz Klein painting on the right. So in this example, Flack's love of color is wedded to the older male abstract expressionists, typically quick, emotion-filled brushstrokes. Both artists use really thick oil paint and visible drips to stress the importance of the creative process of making those artworks as opposed to the finished product, which again is the opposite of photorealism. Scale, as mentioned, of course, in this exhibition, is another important element here. Abstract expressionism was a famously, bold, muscular, people said, big style of painting. Klein's work here is 6.5 feet by 8 feet, and Flack's measures, a not too shabby 4 feet by 6 feet. Ever ambitious, while going back and forth between her interest in abstract expressionism and realist painting, Flack also wanted her own family. And in 1958, she got married to Frank Ezra Levy, a composer and freelance cellist born in Paris, who had gone to music and art high school and also held degrees from Juilliard and the University of Chicago. Everybody agreed it was an excellent match, but this marriage was complicated at the beginning, really, by the birth of their first daughter in 1959. This is Melissa. Flack describes baby Melissa as, quote, "my strangely beautiful child who cried a lot and never slept," end quote. It turned out that Melissa was severely autistic. She has never spoken, and today at the age of 61, lives at a special school for developmentally disabled individuals. Now, anyone who has or knows anyone who has a severely autistic child is, of course, very well aware of the enormous emotional and physical and financial challenges involved in raising that child. But this is, this is 1959. So those challenges were even more daunting, because at that point, the medical establishment didn't offer any kind of treatment. And American society tended to blame the difficulties of these children on what people referred to as their cold, uncaring refrigerator mothers. Excuse me. Nobody would suggest that today, but they did that. This is their second daughter, Hannah. In 1961, she was born. Hannah was healthy and today is a singer-songwriter who plays violin. At this point in the young family's history, Levy's work was, he's freelance, so his work was pretty inconsistent. So to pay the bills, Flack commuted to several part-time teaching jobs at area colleges. This added to the family's stress, but Flack never stopped making art. When her kids was young, Flack said she could only paint at night in the living room, holding Melissa to keep her from crying. Since her daughters never sat still, what children do, Flack painted them from photographs, and given the limited space in their small apartment, as you see there, her paintings were also small at this point. The Brownie camera, I don't know if anybody else here is old enough to remember them, but I used to have a Brownie camera. The Brownie camera that she used produced tiny, like 1 by 2 inch photos, which also were difficult to translate into paintings such as this. There's that photo again, and there's her photo of Hannah. This is from 1963. So at this point, Flack was finally painting realistic representation of peoples and things, but still using, if you can see there, kind of a painterly, meaning a brushy, meaning you see the brushstrokes kind of style, as in another similar work from the same period, Royal Jello, obviously depicting objects they had around the house. Excuse me again, I get emotional. Flack then went through a period of painting current, meaning political events based on newspaper and magazine photographs. Most famously, on the right there, Kennedy Motorcade from 1964, obviously based on the photograph from the previous year on your left, depicting the moments before Kennedy and Governor Connolly were shot in 1963. As far as scale, you can see here, it's not small, but it's certainly not as large as her other works. It's what people might call sofa size. She also painted a similar sized work, this one, Vietnam War Protest March from 1968. But the Audrey Flack that we know today, most of us, emerged the following year, 1969. In 1969, Flack and Levy were divorced, leaving her a single mother with an 8 and a 10-year-old, one of whom required constant attention. Clearly, she had to work hard to keep the various parts of her life together. She says she even remembers considering suicide. Luckily, that year, Flack was commissioned to paint a portrait of the family of Oriole Farr, who was then the director of New York's Riverside Museum, and her husband and their 2 sons. This is the painting. This is the painting. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Farr family portrait from 1970, which, you know, is pretty straightforward. I mean, all 4 people are looking at the artist, or rather they're looking at the camera that Flack used to take the slide on which this painting was based. Everybody looks serious, and there are a few interesting touches in their clothing, like the father's red suspenders and the older son's patterned necktie. And then there's the perhaps ironic aspect here of the younger son holding his own camera, facing the camera person. And going back to the whole thing so you can see it, this painting is large. It's 40 by 60 inches, and you can tell the style is no longer brushy. This is essentially photorealism. She's now using a tight, smooth, detailed kind of technique. And again, a word about that process. This is a little hard to figure out. We're looking from behind Flack as she's working on a projection of that image, painting it on a very, very large scale. So painters had used photographs as reference material, of course, since the invention of photography back in the 1830s, 1840s. But here, Flack has projected her slide onto a big canvas and just started right in painting with no preliminary drawing, which is pretty unusual. It was also very controversial, if you can imagine, at the time. Flack says she lost a lot of friends who felt she was, you know, betraying art by working from photographs. And you have to keep in mind, which may be hard to believe, it was only in the 1970s that the art world per se began to accept that photography was a legitimate art form. I know it seems crazy, but it's true. And many people did object also to this technique because they said it seemed too easy. I had a discussion with a friend who I respect very much just last week. He kept saying, well, photorealism, anybody can do it. Well, I don't know. I don't think anyone could make a photorealistic style painting from a projected slide. I know that I couldn't, especially on that kind of scale. Anyway, things changed in a big way for Flack. There we go. During the 1970s. For one thing, in 1970, she got remarried. So there she is with Bob Marcus. In that year, she married her second and current husband, Bob Marcus, a successful, now retired, New York-based commodities futures trader. And there's a good story. Although Flack was 39 and Marcus was 41 when they got married, they'd actually met decades earlier at a neighborhood dance when she was 13 and he was 15. This is not from them. It's showing them as a very cool New York art couple, but I thought it was a nice picture. Anyway, Flack says she vividly recalls that Bob dipped her when they were dancing and she was just smitten. But they were both, you know, very young, and after several years of group dating, they went their separate ways. But by 1970, both Flack and Marcus had divorced other people, and clearly the spark was still there. So he adopted both of Flack's daughters, and 50 years later, here is the family. That's Hannah standing in the back there, and that's Melissa in the front. So this marriage gave Flack both emotional and, frankly, financial security. And during the decade of the 1970s, as photorealist painting, you know, really started to take off, she became a successful artist. By 1970, a number of American art collectors were tired of both the sort of, you know, introspective angst of abstract expressionism and the obscure seeming monochrome minimalist art of the next decade, that is the 60s. And as a result, and I think also because, unlike my one friend, a lot of people, I think, could immediately tell that photorealism wasn't easy to make and took a lot of training and expertise to be able to produce, it sold very well, which in turn made gallery owners like Meisel very happy. At the same time, inevitably, photorealism suffered a great deal of critical backlash to, this is my opinion now, to, in my opinion, the snobbish elements within the America's art establishment. The fact that so many people liked photorealism really meant it couldn't be that important. Also, some critics complained that photorealism was all surface flash, all technique, with nothing beneath it, which I believe helps explain why it took so long for scholarly books and articles to appear about photorealism. Today, as the pioneer photorealists are reaching their 80s and 90s, this style is starting to experience something of a renaissance, with more exhibitions, more publications, documentary films, and so on, than we've seen in a long time. And of course, there are new generations of painters now working in a photorealist style. In any case, we know Flack's career definitely took off in the 1970s. She had a painting included in the prestigious, this is just the cover of the prestigious 1972 Whitney Annual Exhibition, which later became the Whitney Biennial. She had her first one-person show at Meisel's Gallery in 1974. She received her first honorary doctorate in 1977, and she was commissioned by Time magazine to create the cover image for its Man of the Year issue, dated January 2nd, 1978, celebrating the co-recipient of that year's Nobel Peace Prize, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. At that time, it was very unusual for Time magazine to use a painted portrait versus a photo, but of course, it's photorealism, so it looks like a photo, and I suspect a lot of viewers probably thought it was a photo. And it's also a good example of Flack's pioneering use of a non-traditional technique, namely airbrush, which may require some explanation for young people. Of course, it's just a device with an adjustable nozzle and a reservoir there for the paint. They use acrylic or oil, attached by a hose to an air compressor. And here's an image, there we go, of Flack using an airbrush on that particular painting. Now, there was nothing new about using an airbrush in the 1970s, but the tool was created for industrial purposes, painting cars. Or to retouch photos. This is the part that doesn't make sense anymore to people, but it was used to retouch photos, in fashion magazines. And this is way before there were personal computers, way before Photoshop, et cetera, et cetera. So once again, Flack and a number of the other photorealists were, kind of breaking the rule of fine arts by substituting an industrial technique for the centuries-old use of the traditional brush, although she did use brushes and does use brushes as well. Flack was certainly not the first American painter or even the first photorealist to create very large paintings, but in 1970 and so on, she was still, I would say, pretty audacious for a woman to take so much space up with her work, especially a painting of herself, like that self-portrait, which is 6.5 feet by 5'3" inches, and it's cropped a little bit at the bottom there. You can see how big it is with her next to it. A self-portrait this big demands attention. Moreover, since it looks so much like a blown-up photograph, it must have confused viewers in 1974 at a time when very few art galleries or museums collected or exhibited photography. And if you get a little closer, you can see she really does make certain parts intentionally blurred, and yet she gives a very believable sense of the moisture on the lips, say, or the eyes. But many art historians, myself included, believe that Audrey Flack's most important contributions to photorealism would be her still lifes, that is, paintings of inanimate objects. This kind of painting had existed, of course, since antiquity, but in the 20th and 21st centuries, I would argue it still struggles to get sufficient respect. Like most of Flack's photorealist works, her still lifes are heroically large and unbelievably realistic, usually emphasizing reflective surfaces like mirrors, shiny metal, glass, things like that, that allow the artist to show off her technical skill. And a great example is this, Chanel from 1974, referring in this case not to the cat, that's an inside joke, but rather, of course, to the perfume. You can see there is a Chanel No. 5 bottle right over there. So it's obviously a woman's dressing table with makeup and perfume and 2 small pieces of fruit, a string of silver beads, and various decorative containers, all of them arranged on a mirrored tabletop. It's a really rich, complex composition, reflecting the artist's lifelong love of European Baroque art, which tends also to be very rich and complex. And I am going to compare this to, on your right is a 1962, much earlier, much smaller, still life of cosmetics painted by Flack. Again, in that brushier style, just making the point it's still cosmetics, but it's a different kind of look. Another still life from the 1970s by Flack is Jolie Madame from 1972. This again is huge. Jolie Madame meaning pretty woman, but it also specifically refers in this case to Jolie Madame, to the perfume, which is a little hard to see. It's there, kind of hanging out in the painting. Whoops, there we go. So there's the painting again. Once more, we see jewelry, fruit, fancy containers, myriad reflections, and again, the perfume. Also on the left, our left, we see that small porcelain puto, that is to say, little Cupid figure. And on the left also, you see that rose. We did all that, okay. I wanted to mention this. This is my terminology. This is nothing official, obviously. As a proud second-generation feminist who started graduate school in the mid-1970s, just as Flack's career was taking off, I was, and I still am, dismayed, that's putting it nicely, to read the many, I would say, anti-female criticisms made about these still lifes. And I'm thinking again about works like what we just saw, like Chanel. Over the decades, there have been really quite a few art critics, and as far as I know, they're all male, who have lamented the fact that Flack's still lifes are too feminine to be taken seriously. Now, true enough, many of her still lifes do contain stereotypically female objects, we just saw that, but I myself have never noticed anyone taking Flack's male counterparts to task for focusing their work on stereotypically macho objects like motorcycles and cars, and I'm thinking of works such as those, or those, or that, which granted is a diner, but it emphasizes the cars in the foreground. People also forget, I think, that Flack did produce her own macho still lifes, if you want to think of it that way, such as Royal Flush from 1973, 70 by 96 inches, right? Obviously a poker game with cards and money and pretzels and beer and whiskey and cigars, you know, all that good stuff. Or also by Flack, also 70 by 96 inches, a jumble of do-it-yourself kits for making models of military aircraft and muscle cars. It's called Spitfire. To my mind, though, the most interesting still lifes that Flack has ever produced are her Vanitas paintings. Now, in art historical terms, Vanitas refers to mostly 17th century Dutch still life paintings that use memento mori, that is, reminders of mortality, to encourage viewers to contemplate the ephemeral nature of, you know, youth, beauty, pleasure, and life itself. Hardcore Vanitas paintings hit you over the head with this message, as in this 17th century Dutch still life, featuring a human skull and bone and a pocket watch and a snuffed-out candle and an overturned goblet. You kind of can't miss the point. Flack isn't generally that obvious, but she demonstrates her knowledge of art history in her own series of 3 paintings with the subtitle Vanitas. And I should add that a lot of Flack's still lifes that don't have that subtitle can be viewed as essentially very subtle Vanitas paintings, including Chanel and Jolie Madame. But here I want to consider 2 of Flack's 3 official Vanitas paintings. First, excuse me, Marilyn Vanitas. Vanitas is part of the title, from 1977. This is 96 inches square. So here it is without the distracting words. Now, clearly it's a painting about Marilyn Monroe, a woman so famous more than a half century after her death that she requires no surname, and her face is instantly recognizable, even to people who've never seen her films, and even from an image taken during her pre-Hollywood days, like this black and white photo, or rather this painting of a black and white photo taken from a book that's also painted. Just to show you the source, there is a real black and white photograph that it's from. And just to make the obvious point, a lot of male painters from, you know, Willem de Kooning to Andy Warhol have depicted Monroe, but as far as I know, and I'd love to know if you know other examples, as far as I know, hardly any other female painters besides Flack have taken Monroe as their subject matter. Marilyn Monroe is, you know, the perfect vehicle for a Vanitas image, given her infamous transformation from fresh-faced Norma Jean Mortensen to the blonde bombshell we know better, and her subsequent exploitation, sadly, by Hollywood's star-making machine. If you go back to the whole painting, you can see there's no skull, but Flack has certainly included most of the usual elements of a Vanitas still life updated to 1970s America. So if you look in the bottom there, There's that pink plastic miniature hourglass, probably a kitchen timer. There's a pocket watch on the right there at the bottom. There's a calendar at the top. There's a red candle over here that's burning so that you have red wax coming down it. You have cosmetics, perfume, those same silver beads that turn up in a lot of Flack's paintings, and cut orange and peach fruits there that are getting brown and tacky. And there's also an obviously fake pink satin rose, suspiciously waxy looking green grapes, and a thin paintbrush that's eerily suspended so that, again, blood-like droplets of red paint fall into space. The whole complex composition is anchored by an open book with that real painted text about Monroe. There's also a painted image of a snapshot over here that depicts Flack and her brother as youngsters. Yet another comment, among other things, on the passage of time. So that's the painting, including that photograph, a painted version of the photograph. It's not a collage. And that's the actual photo, if you're still with me. Okay, and that's to show you how big it is. It's big, it's 8 feet square. So going back to the whole of Maryland, some critics have found Flack's paintings too sentimental or excessively kitschy, and scholars still debate the extent to which her works are really sincere or intended to be kind of postmodern ironic. Today, 4 decades after Maryland was completed, the whole concept of kitsch has changed, thanks largely to people like Jeff Koons. But personally, I find these works technically remarkable, emotionally affecting, and intellectually compelling. I also agree with the art critic Robert Morgan, who said, writing in the Brooklyn Rail, that in her paintings, quote, Flack has taken signs of indulgence, beauty, and excess and transformed them into deeply moving symbols of desire, futility, and emancipation. And finally, I didn't forget what we have all been waiting for. World War II Vanitas from 1977. This is also 96 feet square. And of course, it's at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. This is the most shocking and I believe the most important of Flack's Vanitas pictures because clearly it juxtaposes images of luxury and horror in a totally unexpected and very powerful way. The luxury elements here are obvious, including images of fancy pastries, those ubiquitous silver beads, an embossed silver tray, and a gold-rimmed iridescent teacup. There are also memento mori that we've seen before, a clock, a red candle with its wax dripping down like blood, and an obviously fake red rose. In addition, Flack has included a gold-colored Jewish star at the bottom there, taken from her, well, there it is, taken from her own keychain. Flack said that people she knew, even her Jewish painter friends, found that particular detail kind of startling, but she compares it to the presence of crosses in so much Christian art and stresses how appropriate the symbol is in this particular work. The painting, oh, I should show you, sorry, you can see it a little bit better there. The painting also contains a small piece of sheet music and an artificial butterfly, a symbol of the soul in a lot of cases, that's perched on the edge of the cup, an open book with a legible painted text, and taking up more than half the canvas, a painted version of a very famous black and white photo that would have been especially familiar to Americans of Flack's generation, taken by Margaret Brookwhite, the extraordinary photographer and photojournalist, the first American female war correspondent, and a longtime staff photographer for Life magazine. Brookwhite was with General Patton in Germany in the spring of 1945, when Allied forces liberated the notorious concentration camp at Buchenwald, where she captured this devastating image. The contrast among the different elements in this painting, of course, can make onlookers squirm. So it's understandable that some viewers have found this work, people have called it vulgar, people have called it disrespectful. One writer accused Flack of trivializing the Holocaust. Myself, I would say it's worth remembering that Flack herself is Jewish and clearly values at least some aspects of her cultural heritage. She studied Hebrew as a child, she attended Jewish summer camps, she carries a Jewish star on her keychain, and she still goes to synagogue, at least on the high holidays. Also, as noted before, World War II was personal for the Flack family. Her brother Milton was drafted into the US military in 1944, just in time to fight in the infamously bloody Battle of the Bulge. As an 18-year-old, he was reportedly one of only 2 soldiers from his battalion to survive that battle. As she was planning this work, Flack says she recognized that it would be too much if she painted the graphic details of the prisoner's suffering, especially in her photorealistic style. So instead of focusing on bodies or blood, she features survivors, people who somehow made it through this ordeal alive. Flack also chose to excerpt text from a 1976 book in which a noted rabbi is quoted, counseling people to remember and be comforted by the thought that, quote, even in the nethermost pit, God is there, end quote. Flack added, quote, I also wanted to make a beautiful painting. I wanted to seduce the viewer into the work and hold his attention long enough for him to read the quotation and then become involved with interpreting the symbolism, end quote. All art is obviously subjective, so individual viewers may or may not find this painting effective. But I do think it's interesting to note that actual Holocaust survivors, when they were polled about their favorite painting in a 1986 exhibition at New York's Jewish Museum, overwhelmingly chose this one. And several people in this group explained that during their time in the camps, they were sustained by the memory of life's pleasures, flowers, food, a Shabbos candle. The late artist, critic, and poet John Perrault echoed this artist's comments, calling Flack's canvas, quote, breathtaking, and adding, this painting is more about survival than about horror. It is a painting that's difficult to forget, end quote. And just before we move on quickly to Q&A, I just wanted to mention that in the early 1980s, meaning when she turned 50 and beyond, Flack decided that she'd said everything she wanted to say through photorealism. So in another courageous move, she turned to making sculpture, specifically large-scale heroic sculpture of allegorical bronze figures of women, such as Egyptian rocket goddess from 1990, combining obviously aspects, or at least references to ancient art with 20th century details like that rocket-shaped pin on her kind of loincloth. She also, more recently, has turned back to two-dimensional art, large multimedia painted drawings, you might call them, including this one, Fiat Lux, and There Was Light from 2017. This is 6'9" square. It's acrylic paint on canvas with, quote, white and yellow gold leaf and sparkles, unquote, getting back to Baroque decorations. This huge work combines overt kitsch and humor with a heartfelt homage to one of her earliest idols, the 17th century Flemish painter Rubens. You see these figures from his, there it is, Garden of Love, with, of course, Superman and Supergirl, who are not in Rubens' painting. The accolades have come thick and fast in recent years for Flack. That's just referencing one, the prestigious Women Caucus for Art Lifetime Achievement Award. She's one of 4 people who got it in that year. There she is on the left. And of course, the 2019 documentary film about her, Queen of Hearts, among other things. And I think she'd get very mad if I didn't mention that Audrey Flack is an accomplished banjo player and a lover of bluegrass music, of all things. In fact, she's a founding member of Audrey Flack and the History of Art Band, which performs original songs based on various noted artists. Their album is available online. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was fantastic. Such a nice place to end too, with the image of Audrey Flack playing the banjo. I did want to remind folks we have about the next 10 minutes or so for questions. So please feel free to drop things in the chat, or if you'd prefer to ask a question verbally, and we encourage you to, please make sure to raise your hand. So click on the participant button if you're on a computer, and on the right-hand side, it'll say raise hand, or just wave us down. I'll try to see you, because we'd love to hear from you today. We did have a question towards the beginning. I wanted to make sure didn't get lost in the shuffle while other folks maybe formulate what they wanted to say. But Amanda had a question about another artist, Amanda Burden. Janet Fish was also a student of Albers at Yale. Is there any relation between Flack and Fish? That they both ended up going so far afield from their Yale training is interesting.
Good question. Even though I taught for a long time with Alida Fish, who's Janet Fish's sister at the University of the Arts, Alida is a very distinguished photographer. I'm afraid I don't remember what I used to know very much about Janet Fish, who I wrote about decades ago, except that your point is well taken. And I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that if we went through a list of artists, male and female, who worked under Albers, I think a lot of people probably did go off in very different directions. And Janet Fish's paintings, which are gorgeous, are often referred to as photorealists. To me, they have a kind of a different look to them, but they're very beautiful and they're very realistic. And again, I don't think it's myself that surprising that a person would veer away from his, her, their teacher. Just think about Jackson Pollock, who always said the biggest influence on him as a young student was Thomas Hart Benton. And if you know Thomas Hart Benton's work, you wouldn't immediately think that. But after all, what Pollock said was Benton gave him something to react against. And I think that's one thing that teachers probably do.
That's a great point. I noticed, Jen, you have your hand raised. Thank you for that function. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. Go for it.
Hi, I loved your presentation. So informative. I am a photographer, but I also teach elementary art, Nancy. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions for introducing young children to Audrey's work. It's obviously very visceral and full of detail, and that could be a good starting point. But do you have any? I teach elementary art currently fully online, but in Philadelphia.
First of all, congratulations. So challenging, especially at the moment. I can't imagine how you do that, but congratulations for doing it. I have to be honest and say I've never taught, first of all, art, just art history, and I've never taught little kids. So boy, am I a fountain of information. I mean, I don't know, because my first thought is, despite everything I just said, I mean, my dad, my late father, was an artist, and he did both realistic and then most of his career abstract art. And even though my sister and I think it's fair to say, grew up understanding that art could be anything, that it could be abstract, it could be, we didn't know the words, but I mean, it could look like anything, it didn't matter. But I still remember, forgive me, my elementary school teachers saying stuff like, oh, what an interesting drawing, what a nice pony. And you're saying to yourself, that's not a pony, that's, you know, a dog food dish. What is she talking about? It just seemed to me that I remember, I don't know how much things have changed, but I remember decades ago, very much understanding from school that art was supposed to look like what it was supposed to look like, that it was supposed to look like the thing it was depicting, and it was supposed to depict something. So my first thought is, oh dear, I don't know that, and not that you were suggesting that, but I don't know that anybody would want to make a child think that he or she or they should.
Right.
Because I'd love to know more about what you do already. And I don't know if we have time for that, but in other words, I think her photorealist work is kind of a high bar, which might inspire little kids. I don't know. I just wonder if it might also intimidate them, but you would know that better than I would.
That's a good point.
I mean, not that they shouldn't see it, you know, I think it's wonderful.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes their reaction to works I show them is like, oh, I could never do that. But my goal is just to have them look and observe, and that's it, and tell me what they think is going on. So
definitely, if you show them images of, you know, Rembrandt or something, I mean, something considered great old master art, did they still react that way?
I haven't gone there yet much, but no, not always, because sometimes it feels like something so other that they can really.
Uh-oh, did one of us just froze?
Oh yeah, I think it was Jen.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention that we have.
Oh, me.
There you go. I know what you're going to say. Say it.
We have. I did notice we had a hand from the person who runs programs for that audience, actually for our museum, Katerina. I wondered if you wanted to weigh in on this conversation, or if you had another question.
Well, I do have a question, but I kind of feel that I must weigh in on the conversation. Jen, feel free, get my email from Abby. I'll be happy to talk about what PAFA is doing to introduce younger children to artwork, okay, from historical perspective, but also from art making perspective. And we have teacher professional developments, and we have virtual tours. So I'll happy to be in touch and talk more about that.
Thank you.
But I do have a question for Nancy. First of all, I'm an art historian myself, and I rarely enjoy other art historians' presentations. And you are my lucky exception. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. My question, I'm curious if you know, like if it can be a brief answer or if there is a literature on that. I'm curious why she picked photorealism because there was academic style, there was realist style. Why photorealism?
She has written a couple of books. Well, I meant to ask, I'm sorry to interrupt both of us, but Abby, do we have that handout somewhere? Is that available?
I'm going to drop it in the chat. That was a great reminder. As soon as Katarina mentioned that, I'm like, I'm finding, because we have a wonderful resource that Nancy put together, which is just yet another reason why she's the best. But I'm going to drop that in the chat. Folks can download it from here.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
some things, we wrote 4 books about photorealism, and she, you probably know, she meaning Flack, wrote several books as well, including one that's kind of her comments. And I'm trying to think if I remember a specific, of course I have it over there somewhere, but there's a piece that she wrote. It's not Audrey Flack on painting, but it's something like that. I'm thinking of Alberti. But she talks a little more about that. But the interesting thing to me, and this isn't really an answer, I'm sorry, but the interesting thing to me is that, at least what I've read, is that the various people we think of as like the major, the famous, you know, photorealists, first of all, didn't know about each other and didn't plan this together. And it was sort of one of those things in the zeitgeist, you know, it was just never a very good explanation for anything. But that was part of it. And I don't think I have a very good answer, actually, because I'm trying to remember a specific quote from her that would really address that, and I can't offhand think of one. So I think I need to reread her book, perhaps, but I mean, recommend that. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
I did just drop that in the chat. So thank you, Katarina, for that question. It's for and for Nancy. Feel free to download from there. And I wanted, if we didn't have any other hands raised, just kind of a quick question for you, but also just to tie it back in, since this is connected to our exhibition, which fingers crossed will be opening in January. I know we had one of the curators in Brooke here, but I think they had to run. But it's called Taking Space, Women Artists and the Politics of Scale. And I wondered, Nancy, if you could address kind of, if you know of any of Flack's sort of purposefulness behind her use of scale, because I do think there's a lot of politics in her, the things she chose to represent. And I loved you kind of breaking down the like girly versus macho, but also if there was any kind of political standpoint as a woman painting that large and the things she chose to paint that large.
She always says like that she isn't a feminist. She's an artist who does whatever. But I mean, she, in my terms, she is, so whatever. But clearly she's thinking that way, whatever she wants to call herself. This may be what I already said, but the general gist of it, as far as I'm aware, is that it was, of course it was intentional. And I think it was partly that I think it really was partly that she was inspired initially by the abstract expressionist folks. And that there was something, because there really was something very courageous, even for them, right? About not just working abstractly, but working abstractly in large. You know, it was what did Woody Allen used to say, the food is bad and there were such small portions, he went more, you know? So it's kind of the opposite. It's not only were they abstract, but they were wasting a lot of canvas being abstract. But I think it just goes back to that idea that people, women particularly, were not known for painting large. And that it's like what Georgia O'Keeffe said, if she had painted flowers small, nobody would have noticed, but she painted them huge. So you had to get people's attention. She said particularly specifically to get the attention of busy New Yorkers. I mean, I think I'm just being very obvious here, but I think on a superficial level, I think she was very consciously saying, okay, this stuff is important and it's meaningful and I'm important and I'm meaningful. And you're going to have to look at it. You may not like it, but you can't ignore these paintings when you see them.
Thank you. I think that's a great kind of end to our program today. And thinking about, we hope that in January, for those of you who are local, you'll be able to see Vanitas and a lot of other amazing women artists who are painting big that you can't ignore, or exploring those themes in other ways. So, but I did want to thank you, Dr. Heller, and thank everyone for being here with us for our last live program that I'm facilitating for 2020. Please feel free to unmute on your way out and say goodbye. We're so lucky to have you here with us, and we hope to see you again in 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Great.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Loved it.
Thank you.